Hi, Rob Smythe here. I just got finished meeting with a gentleman and a lady who come to the door about once a month. They bring their magazines, and I feel bad if I don't accept their magazines and tell them that I'd be glad to look at them. The two seem to be sincerely interested in my well-being. They're always nice people. If they're interested in making sure I don't go to hell and I go to heaven instead, I got to classify them as great humanitarians. They're trying their best for my welfare. I used to have great discussions with them or their colleagues over the years until I discovered that I didn't seem to get very far. Of course, they didn't seem to get very far with me. The gentleman today, when he found out that I was a science teacher, he said, "Do you know, there is scientific evidence for God's existence?" I expressed interest, and I said, "What evidence do you have in mind?" He pointed to the beauty of a rainbow and the loveliness of a butterfly. Now, I kind of grimaced because I found that evidence a little weak, and I said, well, if beauty is evidence of God's existence, then is ugliness evidence that God doesn't exist? How about that dirt over there, or that pollution over there, or that ugly spider, or whatever it was that he and I might both agree is non-beauty? And he would have none of that, of course. Beauty was evidence of God's existence, but non-beauty was not evidence of God's non-existence. I tried to point out that the statement then that God exists is not a scientific statement. He shouldn't be trying to justify God's existence scientifically. He should just say, I believe it to be true because in my heart I believe it. But no, God exists. That's a factual statement, he said. So, let's take the statement, God exists. Is that a scientific statement? Well, what qualifies a scientific statement? Scientific statement has to be testable, observable, and negatable, which means if evidence supports the statement, then we accept it. If evidence goes against the statement, we reject it. Suppose I had this statement: the universe is contracting. We'll call this Smythe's contracting universe theory. Okay? Everything in the universe is contracting. The spaces between the atoms is decreasing. All the atom sizes are decreasing. The quarks, the electrons, the protons, the makeup atoms, they're all shrinking. Everything is shrinking. Okay? Well, you might say, I could test that out. Let's check it. Let's just get that meter stick and measure that card table. Wait a few minutes, we'll measure it again. Look, it's the same size, you say. Your statement is false. Of course, I have a rescue position, don't I? I just say, well, the ruler was shrinking too. So of course, it came up to the same measurement. And you, being a skeptic, might propose other tests for the shrinking universe theory, the volume that something makes up, something like that. And I keep countering that the measuring instruments are shrinking by the same ratio, therefore you can't detect it. You might finally get frustrated and say, look, Smythe, is there any test that I could do to show that the universe is shrinking? Because if there is no test, then Smythe's shrinking universe claim would be a statement of religion, of philosophy, of belief, but not science. Okay. Well, what about the statement, God exists? Is there any test that can be done to show God's existence? Well, let's pretend there is one. Let's pretend that when you mix these two liquids, it turns yellow. Now you might say, that's a dumb test. But the point is, it doesn't matter what the test is for the purpose of our argument. We're just assuming there is a test, so we might as well pretend it's the color that two liquids turn when mixed. Okay? So I take these two colorless liquids, I mix them, I get this brilliant yellow, and I say, therefore God exists. I take them over to New York, and I mix them and show that in New York it turned yellow, so God exists there too. Everywhere in the world I do this, and they always turn yellow. God exists, everybody's happy. All the religious people are happy anyhow. because I've demonstrated God's existence with a test that we've all agreed is a test for God's existence, okay? Now, one day, I mix the two, and they turn green. I say, holy smoke, these always turn yellow and it turned green. It's amazing. It would be like if I step off into space off the top of a wall, and I always fall, but then one day I just hover there. Or when I jump off a diving board and dive into the water, which I've done many, many times, maybe one day I land on the surface of the water and I walk across a swimming pool. How can that happen? Well, it's got an obvious explanation. It's a miracle. A miracle is something that goes contrary to the laws of physics, right? It's something that happens that has no explanation because it shouldn't have happened. And what's a miracle evidence for? God's existence. So whether these two things turned yellow, which is supposedly meant God exists, or not yellow, which was a miracle and therefore God exists, the statement God exists is true whether these two things turned yellow or didn't. So our test for God's existence, in fact, was a non-test because it was irrelevant. It didn't matter whether it succeeded or failed. It supported the existence of God. Thus there, of course, you see where I'm going with this, thus there is no test for God's existence. I'm not saying God doesn't exist. Science doesn't say God doesn't exist. Science says nothing at all about God. The point is that the statement God exists is a non-scientific statement, and believers should just say it's something they deeply feel is true, and not try and get evidence for their position.